The prehistory of the modern Jewish state in the 19th and first half of the 20th century is usually told as follows. Jewish settlers who emigrated to Palestine due to persecution in Eastern Europe colonized the country and intended to revive the ancient Jewish state. They were inspired by a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl, the father of political Zionism. In doing so, they got help from the British and ignored the local Arab population, whom they marginalized. So they created a conflict that continues to this day. In this narrative, the Jewish state becomes a historical oddity and a permanent troublemaker in the region. Unfortunately, this narrative is wrong on virtually every level. When I studied the history of the Middle East, I choose to do so in a comparative approach, and over time gained a more fresh perspective on Israel and the Eastern Mediterranean. I published extensively on this topic, and here I want to offer you my comparative perspective and explain why Israel's critics are wrong. Cultural revivalist movements, French revolutionary ideas, and the creation of national languages are the cornerstones of a political process that began to take place in the 19th century. At that time, it was not just the Middle East that was transformed, but also parts of Europe and the rest of the world. In the transition of empires and kingdoms into the nation-state order that exists to this day, Israel is one of many states that came into being. The impetus for this transition came from the Greek, who began to rise in 1821. It was inspired by the philosophers of the French Revolution, but also by the German philosopher Herder, whose ideas spilled over from the German-speaking countries to the Ottoman Empire. The bridgehead for Herder's ideas was Vienna. Ridus Ferreus had been active in Vienna, where he made propaganda for the Greek cause. Unfortunately, he got arrested and was transferred to the Ottoman authorities, who executed him in Belgrade in 1798. It was also in Vienna where Theodor Herzl had his fruitful time. Herzl is undoubtedly the outstanding figure when it comes to the idea of a Jewish nation-state, the icon of political Zionism. Yet his ideas didn't come out of the blue, but were triggered by two rabbis from Southeast Europe and Eastern Europe, Yehuda Alkalai from Serbia and Zvi Hirsch Kalischer from Poland. Alkalai in particular had written a whole series of writings calling for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, and personally visited the large Jewish communities in Europe, Constantinople, and in Palestine for this purpose. His colleague Kalischer asked the Jews to follow the example of the Italians, Poles, and Hungarians. Theodor Herzl, on his part, had met Alkalai personally in Vienna in 1873 and had come into contact with Kalischer's ideas through the latter's treatise Roman Jerusalem, written by the German Zionist Moses Hess, published in 1862. One must be aware that there were peoples in the Ottoman Empire, but no nations in the modern sense of the word. Take, for example, the Greeks. In the 19th century, it was far from being clear who was a Greek. The first National Assembly of Astros in 1823 defined a Greek as someone who speaks Greek. But many define themselves as being Greek without speaking Greek. So the National Assembly later on revoked this definition and defined anyone as being Greek who was a native Christian in Southeast Europe, and later on as anyone who was a native Christian in Southeast Europe and who fought or has fought against the Ottoman Turks. So you see that something like a Greek historical continuity did exist, and a kind of sense of being Greek, but a clear definition of who was Greek was still missing, and that needed an educational system. And an educational system needed a national language. So there was a Greek language, but there was no Greek national language that met the requirements for business, administration, and literature. National languages still had to be created. On the one hand, Hebrew was never really dead. The Yemenite Jews had preserved it orally. There is an account of this written by the scholar Shlomo Morag under the title Ha'ivrit Shebapei Yehudei Teiman. Hebrew was also still in use as a written language. Still in the 19th century, it was the preferred written language amongst the Jews of Egypt. On the other hand, Hebrew was far from fulfilling the role of a modern national language. But in this, it was in no way different from other languages in the region, be them Turkish, Greek, or Albanian. All these national languages finally were created mostly in the process of learning by doing. They were somehow shaped in all those journals and newspapers that were popping up in the late Ottoman era, and they were shaped by translations. And the biggest challenge for all translators was, you don't believe it, if you don't know it, you would never believe it, was the works of Homer, especially the Iliad. The Iliad became the ultimate test for every newly created national language. The Iliad was characterized by a rich vocabulary, and it has always been at the forefront in the literary canon of Europe. So, by and through translations into the respective national language, these languages reconnected themselves to the oldest layers of European history. So, the national languages were created as being something new for the modern world, and at the same time being deeply rooted in European history. In part 2, I will give you a glimpse into the translation movements of that time, and I will explain what the Turkish city of Iskenderun, that is the ancient Alexandretta, has to do with Syria's ongoing enmity towards the Jewish state. Stay tuned!